Very, very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Jnanavaca, and this is the first of a series of 5 seminars that we'll do. I don't know if seminar is the right word, but anyway, we've got 5 hours between 5 and 6 p.m. To look at the question of death, and it's building up to our parinirvana celebrations. Oh, Gabby's here. Hello, Gabby. So it's building up to us commemorating, marking the parinirvana, or the passing away of the body of the Buddha. And so I'm going to be looking at death from different perspectives, dharmic perspectives, but also personal, my own sort of reflections and experiences. And what we'll do is I'll talk for a bit, I don't know how long for, and then we'll open it up for questions from you. And I'm joined here at the moment by Seb and David, who I live with in the community above the LBC. They're my tech team. So they'll read out questions if you put them in the chat. That's how we'll do it. I want to start by just doing a little bit of settling into meditation. Meditation's too big a word for a couple of minutes of settling. But I would also like us to bring metta into our hearts. Literally just before coming down to the shrine room from my bedroom upstairs, I was doing last minute emails and I received an email from a friend who's a mitra in our Sangha called Dan, and I don't think he'll be tuning in, but he may watch later, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying. Anyway, the email said that last night his dad died, his father died, and that his response was to chant mantras, the Avalokiteshvara mantra, and he'll be doing rituals, including the Vajrasattva puja and mantras. But I'm sure that not only for Dan, but Dan's father, who has just died, and then, of course, all the, I don't know, thousands of people who have just died last night, this morning, today. Let's just extend our metta to them, wish them well. The people who have died and the people who have been left bereaved. See if we can just open our hearts to them just for a few minutes. And then I'll, to bring us out of the meditation, just those few minutes, I'm going to read a Rumi poem, and then I'll say what I want to do, to talk about. So see if you can just make yourself comfortable wherever you are, and whether you're sitting on a cushion or on a sofa, that's fine. Just sit as comfortably as you can. Closing your eyes when you're ready. Perhaps taking a few deeper breaths. And becoming aware of your own body and its sensations. And becoming aware of the heart. So let's cultivate metta for ourselves, for each other. But particularly for those who have just died all over the world. One of those recent deaths being Dan's father. Wishing him well, wishing all those who have just died well. And coming back to a sense of yourself, your body, how you're feeling. At the end of pain, a quiet, white exhaustion, your ghost sits down to hold my head in its hands. Good. So, over the course of the next 5 days, we can explore death from different perspectives, but today I want to start more personally and talk about my experience of bereavement and how that's shaped my life, and also how I make sense of the experience in the light of the Dharma, what effect it's had on me in the light of the Dharma, but also how I make sense of it. So I hope you'll indulge me and let me talk personally. And then I'll do that for, I don't know, a little while, and then open up for questions. Um, so some of you will know my story because I talk about it in talks, but a very significant experience for me was the death of my father when I was 11. And he was quite young, 45, and it was a sudden death, unexpected, of a heart attack. A bit like today in London and probably elsewhere in the UK, it was snowing that day, and I can very much remember that. I was very excited because it was snowing and the snow had settled, and I was out playing with my friend Darren in the snow and was late home from school as a result. And my dad came in early from work, I think, saying that he didn't feel quite well, and went to bed without any dinner, I think. It's difficult to know if my memories are accurate or whether they're just how I've subsequently sort of perceived things. But it was definitely snowing. And in the night, he started having chest pains. And my mother woke me up. There was just me and my mother and my dad at home. My sister had just gone to college. She had just started teacher training in Brighton. And my mother woke me up to ring the doctor. And so I did. Anyway, he died. He died quite a few hours later. The ambulance took, I mean, this was in the 70s, and they weren't so good at, I don't know, responding to heart attacks. So that it took several hours, probably about 4 or 5 hours for the ambulance to arrive. I mean, the doctor arrived and he said it wasn't a heart attack. It was just chest pains, and gave him painkillers, and, and then it wouldn't go away. And by the end, he was in agony. And so I remember praying. I wasn't religious, I didn't think, but I came from a Hindu family, and I remember chanting a mantra and imagining. So I'd been told to go back to bed, as it were, and I can remember imagining a string of mantras as I chanted them, forming a protective wall around the house, and that death wouldn't come in. I mean, I sort of imagined that the mantras would protect me from death, him from death. And he, at one point called me to his bedside, and he was writhing in agony, and but could speak. And basically, he was sort of saying how he had not been kind enough in his life, that he'd been quite a hot-tempered man, controlling, hot-tempered, and he was wanting to get that off his chest, confess that really, how he'd hurt people and hadn't been as kind, how he'd hurt people is what he kept saying. Anyway, I was told to go back to bed, and a cousin of mine who was in his 20s was, by this time, had come round to support my mum and me, and he stayed with me. But apparently the ambulance arrived. I think I fell asleep. So it was about 4 or 5 in the morning, the ambulance arrived. And my mum went with my dad in the ambulance, and he died en route to the hospital. And so when I woke up, my mum was already back, and I can remember the house was suddenly full of crying and weeping, and it's sort of horrendous, really. And as I realized what had happened, one of my memories is that I was I berated myself for not having the protective wall of mantras be wrapped around him rather than around the house, because he died when he left the house, rather than, so the mantras worked, but not, I got it wrong. Anyway, that was one of the thoughts that went through my mind. But there's more I could say about the immediate effects of his death, but what I want to focus on now is that I, as a sort of precocious 11-year-old, was interested in the paranormal and wanted to get in touch with him to see if there was anything beyond death. So now I had my own sort of relative. My father was in the spirit world, his ghost, or whatever I wanted to think of it, was there, so I could conduct an experiment to see if he would talk to me. So I used to play with his playing cards. He had a deck of cards, and he'd used to play Patience or Solitaire or something. And I would talk to him in my mind, and then I would ask the cards I'd ask the question of him, and get the cards. I'd sort of hold the deck loosely and push up some of the cards with one of my fingers, and one of the cards would come up to the top, if you see what I mean. And the questions were always yes or no questions. And I wanted to see if the answer was yes, I asked for 5 of hearts. It was always a 5 of hearts. If the answer was no, it was an 8 of spades. And if it was a don't know, it was a 3 of diamonds. And so these cards would reveal themselves to me, and I got consistent responses. Now, unfortunately, as an adult, I cannot remember what I asked him. I have got no real recollection of my questions. But all I know is that they were consistent in their responses over a number of years, not just once. So that went on in my teens, and every so often I'd talk to him and ask him questions. I'd always asked for an ace of hearts before by the way, I'm not recommending this, I'm just telling you what I did. I don't want to suddenly set you off into, doing seances and things. I'm just saying this is what I did. So I was and I'd always ask for an ace of hearts before I started the session of questions, and the ace of hearts represented him. So it was in my childhood imagination, it was like, if you show me an ace of hearts, I'll know it's you and not some evil spirit that's trying to take over. And then one day I was walking down the road, and I saw this ace of hearts on the road, on the pavement. And of course, that just confirmed for me that I was in touch with him. Other things happened later on in my life when I came across the Dharma in my late 20s. I went through a phase of not knowing whether this was right for me. So, for example, on my first retreat, I was really overwhelmed with what I'd found. I felt like this was what I'd been looking for all my life. And I remember lying in bed asking my father, was this the right thing for me to be doing? Or was I getting involved in some weird cult? Was this real? Was it appropriate? Was it right? And when I came home from retreat, I was at work. I used to work in Baker Street in some offices and in London. And I was itching to stop work so that I could come to the Buddhist Center. And the Buddhist Center at the LBC, there was going to be a sort of reunion of the retreat that night. So we were all going to gather and come into Sangha night together. So all day I was clock watching, not really keeping an eye doing my work, just clock watching really. At 5:30, I ran out of the office, as it were, to come home, I got to Baker Street's tube station, and I was sort of dashing down the steps of the tube station, and on the steps, and I could have chosen various platforms because there were various ways of getting from Bethnal Green, from Baker Street to Bethnal Green. But anyway, I ran. There was a tube waiting in one of the platforms, and I ran to get it. As I was running down the stone steps, there was this downturn playing card on the stone steps, and I glanced at it. I mean, I saw it and thought, that's for me. But the tube was waiting, so I didn't pause to pick it up. But as I got to the train, the doors closed and I missed it. And then I came back to pick up the playing card, which was a 5 of hearts, which was a yes. Subsequent, I've had other sort of things happen to me that have been him communicating with me, and I haven't got time to go into all of them. But as a kid, when this started happening to me, one of the things that it raised for me, and I think this is the key point that I want to leave this bit of my talking with. One of the key things that it raised for me is, if death isn't the end, so I was convinced by now that death wasn't the end, that I was in touch with my father. If death isn't the end, then what is life? What am I doing here? I knew, I couldn't articulate it, but I knew that there was a bigger context, a bigger perspective than just this life. So death isn't the end, so then there's a bigger context. But surely that meant something for what I did with this life. And I was convinced as a teenager that what most adults seem to be doing with their lives, what my father had done with his life, wasn't the purpose of life in the context of death not being the end. Something more was going on. There was a bigger perspective. And what was I going to do? Was I going to ignore that bigger perspective and carry on, I don't know, just with a normal life? Or was I going to, in a way, get to the bottom of it? What was the truth if death wasn't the end? What was life? And of course, that's what led me to the Dharma, or it was one of the questions that led me to the Dharma. And of course, I don't know the answers, but I do know that death isn't the end. But I don't want to just talk about those psychic occurrences, and there were more, and too many to, in a way, go into. I don't want to talk about them just as some sort of special titillating fact about my life. I want to do it so that, well, what am I trying to say? If you on Netflix at the moment, there's this series called Surviving Death, which I really recommend. I particularly recommend episode 1 and episode 6. All of them are good, but particularly 1 and 6. 1 is talking about people, looking at people with near-death experiences. And number 6 is looking at people, kids who have got memories of past lives. And, you know, and can remember previous lives. In between, there are episodes talking to mediums who can contact, you know, the spirit world. And what I want to say is, do watch that documentary. I think it's really interesting. But what I was struck by is that none of those people who had either near-death experiences or were contacted by their spirit, by relatives who had died, or none of them particularly, at least in the documentary, was saying, well, what does this mean for life? What does it mean for how I should be living my life? So there were lots of people who were comforted by contacting their bereaved, by contacting their deceased relatives. But none of them then, I mean, actually, that's not completely true. It did have transformative experiences for some people, particularly those that had near-death experiences. So I take that back. It's not completely true. But I wanted the documentary to really probe the question of what is it that we should, what does it mean for our lives? Because I think that's the most important. That's the most important thing for us now as Dharma practitioners. How are we going to live our lives? And Buddhism puts a lot of emphasis on reflecting on death, but it does so primarily from the emphasis of saying, well, what are you going to do with your life? What are you going to do with the time that you've got in the context of knowing that death isn't the end? What are we going to do with it? And for me, the obvious answer, I can't sort of logically tell you why, but the obvious answer is that you have to work on your own consciousness. And when I say work on your own consciousness, what I mean is becoming more aware and more kind, and exploring what it is to be conscious at all. What is the deepest meaning of consciousness and of being alive? What are we doing, and who are we? Who are we really? If death isn't the end, then who are we? So for me, that's been an abiding question from childhood, probably actually even before my dad's death. And it's still a question. It's not that I've got the answers, but that question has become a quest. It's not just a question anymore. It's a quest in my life. And maybe that's too grand a word for it, because frankly, when I think of myself, I'm too often just watching YouTube videos and not really questing in any grand sense. But nevertheless, it's been a current that has shaped my life and has led me to become a Buddhist, to become ordained. And when I meditate, which I do most days, I still bring to mind my father and my mother, who died about 10 years ago. I can still feel her presence, particularly her presence, more than my father's presence now. And I try and remember the perspective of death, and what will that mean? What should that mean for how I want to live my life, how I want to spend that day? I try and do that. I forget. A lot of the time I forget. So let me just pause there and see if there are any questions arising from anything I've said. You can post the questions in the chat. And you can ask me about my personal experience. I'm happy to go into it. But more than that, I'm interested in this question of, well, I guess, what do you believe happens after death? Do you believe that there is some sort of continuation of consciousness after death? What leads you to that? I mean, these are questions that maybe you can reflect on between now and tomorrow, and then tomorrow we might have time to see some responses. But also, what difference does that make to your life? So I don't know, Seb, have we got any questions? So we haven't got any questions at the moment. So, oh yeah, no, we have.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So there's one from, oh no, you asked them, Seb, because
Sure.
I can't see them all.
Sure. Here's a question. How do you deal with a deep-seated sense that you have lost a life support?
Yeah, so that's from Lisa. How do you deal with a deep-seated sense that you have lost a life support when you lose somebody? Of course, bereavement is life-changing, and you can't just go back to how you were before. It's said, isn't it, that when you lose somebody very close, it's not that you ever get over it. You adjust. Your life is never the same again, and it is still life, and you adjust. Ideally, you adjust, but that adjustment, of course, can take many, many years. I think in our culture, we assume that, after a few months or maybe after a year, that you should be over it. I don't think, as I say, you ever get over it. What for me, though, is really important is my conviction that well, I want to send, want to help those that have died as well as those that are living. So when my mother died, you know, it was very painful. It was only 10 years ago, so I was an adult then. But what I focused on at that time particularly was wishing her well. And her well in meditation, in rituals, doing pujas for her. It had a huge effect on me. I mean, of course, I believe that it had an effect on her. And as I say, I could feel her presence very, very strongly for about 3 months. But it also had a huge effect on me. And I can honestly say that those 3 months after her death were inspired for me. I mean, they were an inspired, magical time. So I think as well as coming to terms with our own loss, it's very important, I think, to just also cultivate metta, wish the person who's died well. Subhuti was recently doing some study with us in our community, and he was talking about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and one of the things he was saying is that the tradition says that after the person's body has died, their consciousness becomes hugely more sensitive than when they were, as it were, shielded by the physical body, and that they can pick up on our thoughts, our metta. You know, they'll be much more sensitive to that, and they need that. They need, you know, that will do them good. So I don't really think that's an answer to your question, Lisa. You were asking more about the process of being bereaved, and in a way, I don't want to sort of give you platitudes. I don't really know, but all I can say is that for me, the Dharma and this perspective of helping somebody who has passed on is very, very important to me. Really, really important, and has helped me, and still does. Should we see if there's any other?
Sure. So Buddha Samagama has asked, if we deeply understand that death is not the end, then why do Buddhists grieve? Is this only ego?
Yeah, so if we deeply understand that death is not the end, why do Buddhists grieve? And is this only ego? Well, I think I grieve because I'm not enlightened. And yes, there's attachment. And grief is a sort of natural response. So I'm not over being attached to people, loved ones in my life. And I think that's kind of all right. I'm all right with that. As long as I'm sort of trying to deepen my practice, I don't mind the fact that I'm not enlightened. But then I'm struck by, there's a story of the Buddha, and two of his disciples, Shariputra and Moggallana, died before the Buddha died. And there's a story of them coming to take leave of the Buddha. They know that this is the last time they'll see the Buddha. And it's very, very touching how, you know, and they're enlightened disciples, and the Buddha's obviously enlightened, very, very touching how they're obviously sad that they're not going to see each other again. And that the Buddha, when he's told that they've died, and they seem to die close to each other, when he is obviously affected by that. I don't know if you would call it grief, but he's affected. And I think that that's completely right in a way. It's human. And as I say, my own experience of my mother's death particularly, which was more recent, wishing her well and feeling her presence, I can honestly say most of my experience was something akin to joy and feeling very, very in touch with the Dharma and feeling blessed grateful, joyful. She died well, so that helped, and she was, she was in her 70s and ready to go, so that helped. But the grief wasn't unmixed with a sense of joy, wonder, even a sort of ecstatic at times, blissful sense. Yeah. So,
a question from Rupesh is death something we return to?
Is death something we return to? So, Rupesh, thanks for asking that. Your question I could take in a couple of ways. Later on during this week, I'm going to talk about the Buddhist notion of rebirth. And just to say now that there is this notion that we have lived many lifetimes already, and that we'll carry on living lifetimes in some sort of form, at least until we're enlightened, and then we'll probably not have to come back, although enlightened beings might come back in order to benefit other people. So in that sense, death is something that we return to. But perhaps more sort of more poetically, Buddhists are encouraged to keep returning to the notion of death. They're encouraged to keep reminding themselves that they're mortal, that they will die, and that I will die, and that everyone around me will die. That's a practice that we're encouraged to keep coming back to, the fact of death. And as I was saying, the reason that is encouraged, the reason that reflecting, contemplating death is a practice, well, one of the reasons is so that we make the most of life, so that we don't waste our lives on things that really don't matter so much. In the Dhammapada, there's a verse that says those, I haven't got it on me, but others do not know that they're all heading for death, that we're all heading for death. Those that do know that we're all heading for death end their quarrels. So that's a death perspective that's really helpful. If we bring to mind that I'm going to die, I don't know how long I've got, and that the person that I feel quarrelsome with, aggrieved by, is also going to die, hopefully that sort of reflection puts a bigger perspective on my own grievance, and maybe I'd end my quarrels. Maybe I'd try and be kinder. Maybe I'd learn forgiveness a bit more. That's one perspective. But also, as I was saying, well, I don't know, I suspect that none of us are very sort of awful in terms of unskillfulness in our lives. But speaking personally, so I don't think I've done anything very bad in my life. But goodness, I do get lost in trivia. My life, it's embarrassing as a Buddhist who's been ordained for 20-something years. If you watched, well, my community, part of whom are sitting there, are smiling because, I just get lost in trivia. Silly things on Netflix or YouTube or just, I don't know, watching the news again and again, reading the BBC News site. It's trivial. And I think that reflecting on death to the extent that I do saves me from my own trivial mind. Yeah. So returning to death from that perspective is important. Yeah. Yeah, one more.
Okay, so Brenda's asked, around certain topics in surviving death, I felt uncomfortable, particularly around mediums / ghosts. How to be open but also not gullible? Okay,
yeah. So Brenda's asking about, I think you're asking about the Netflix documentary, is that right? Surviving Death. And a couple of episodes are about mediums. And How do we not be gullible around such things? Okay, so I think that we've got to be careful, because not all mediums will be the genuine article, and it is easy to be taken in. And I do believe that some mediums are the genuine article. I have been to a medium myself, and I believe that, she was genuine. But the point for me is, in a way, going to a medium, if you do that, isn't the dharmic point. The dharmic point is that, what are we going to do with this life? And I would be careful about thinking that the Dharma is saying we've got to somehow find out what happens after death, and mediums might be able to help us. The main thing I think that the Dharma is saying is, what are we going to do with this life, in the context, in the knowledge that death isn't the end? None of us really knows what's going to happen after death, and the mediums don't either. And some of them might not be genuine. So I'd be wary of getting sucked into a spiritualist perspective. I'm also I want to say, look, Buddhism says death isn't the end, and yes, there is rebirth and so forth, and that consciousness survives death. But really, Buddhism's saying that there's more than any of those rebirths. There's something beyond life and death. There's enlightenment is said to be a release from this round of birth and death. So Buddhism isn't that concerned about finding out what happens exactly once we die. It's more concerned about, can we get off this round of birth and death and rebirth and re-life and re-death? Can we get off that? Because there is a transcendent state, which isn't a great way of putting it. There's a state of being, a mind, that the Buddha experienced, and enlightened beings through the ages have experienced, which is ultimate freedom. And he called it, one term that he used for enlightenment was the deathless. The deathless. The Buddha, before he was enlightened, when he was a young man, went on his quest because he wanted an answer to the question of death. And enlightenment was his realization, fulfillment of that quest. And he said that the deathless had been attained, which was a state beyond life and death. So when I watch Surviving Death, or when I've been to a medium, that wasn't the perspective that I got, that they were questing after a transcendent state. They might be able to put you in touch with a loved one who's died, but that is still within conditioned existence, and not particularly what Buddhism's concerned with. Yeah, and you have to be careful about, yes, being too gullible. In particular, I would be really careful if anybody, a medium or anybody else, tells you something about the future, or something that you should be doing with your life. I wouldn't take, so I have had experiences of my father coming through, and my mother. But when my father was alive, I disagreed with him on lots of things. And if he'd lived longer, and I knew him as an adult, as me as an adult, if I'd had an adult relationship, I think we would have disagreed on lots of things. So why should I sort of follow his advice just because he's dead? And I wouldn't advise you to sort of trust the advice of a medium if they're giving you advice about what you should be doing with your life. Does that make sense? Because they might be wrong. They might not really be in touch with somebody who's died. And even if they are in touch with a relative who's died, that person who's died, their perspective is probably limited. It's not likely to be an enlightened perspective. Does that make sense? So yes, as I say, I did go to a medium, but it's not something that I'd want to do very often or make a habit of. And I also now don't feel the need. I feel that I can be in touch with, particularly with my mother, if I want to be. And one of the things that when she came through this medium, there was me and my sister, and one of the things that she said was to my sister, and she said, "You must learn to meditate. You must learn to meditate. And if you meditate, you'll not need. You'll feel me." Yeah, certainly that's my experience. So I hope that helps, Brenda. So yeah, do watch this Surviving Death documentary, but primarily why I'm suggesting it is because in our Western culture, many people assume that they know what happens after death and that it's nothing, that death of the body is the end of all consciousness. And I think the documentary was good for challenging that perspective. But it's limited because it doesn't talk about transcendence. It doesn't talk about a transcendental perspective of enlightenment. Yeah? So from a Buddhist perspective, that's limited. Maybe we've got time for one more.
Okay, so Carol has said, she's asked, the Surviving Death TV series included a study suggesting that consciousness is not located in the brain. There is still so much we don't know about how our brains and bodies work. Is wanting to believe that something continues after death clinging to the sense of self?
Okay, did you hear that question? Shall I read it out again for the mic? Okay, so Caro is asking, the Surviving Death documentary suggested that consciousness is not located in the brain, that there's much that we don't know really about our brains and our bodies. And certainly I'd add, we don't know about consciousness. And then she asks, it's a supplementary kind of thing, is wanting to believe that something continues after death a clinging to the sense of self? And yes, it can be. Yes, it can be. So that's another reason why I don't think as Buddhists we sort of encourage the practice of, say, going to mediums or so forth, in that it could just be a clinging to not wanting to let go of whoever's died. It can be. And I think it's again, I just want to say that on the one hand, you could have a clinging to a sense of self that is going to carry on after the death of the body, and that could be a danger. On the other hand, the other danger is that one could be wedded to a belief or a view that the death of the body is the death of consciousness, is the end of everything. And that implies that consciousness is just an arising in the brain, a byproduct of the brain, and that we are really just biological machines. So that's another danger. Buddhism would say you've got those twin dangers. One is clinging to the sense of self and believing that the sense of self will go on forever. Another is clinging to the notion that the body is all there is and that consciousness is just a byproduct, an epiphenomenon of brain function. And they're both dangers. And I want to come back to this question of what is the middle way that the Buddha taught between those two. But for now, the reason I've talked about my conviction that death isn't the end is because I'm trying to address the notion that death is the end. Does that make sense? Because that's such a prevalent notion in our culture. That's such a prevalent notion, this scientific materialism, that the body is all there is a respectable view in our culture. Whereas if you talk about death not being the end, that's still quite an unusual perspective, and many will laugh at you and say, "Well, you've just lost the plot." So I want to sort of, that's why I was pleased with this documentary, Surviving Death, that mainstream television was, in a respectable way, exploring the fact that death isn't the end. When it comes to brain and the body, I mean, who knows what's going on? But I tend to, my own view is that it might be that the brain is a sort of mediator for consciousness, just like a radio is a mediator for radio waves. So if you want to listen to the radio, you can't just pick up the radio waves that are in the air, in the ether. You need a bit of equipment called a radio, which will tune in to those radio waves. But you wouldn't say that the radio was the cause or the generator of those radio programs. You'd say that the radio was a receiver. Yeah? Similarly with telly and so forth. Well, I kind of think that the brain might be more like that, a receiver of consciousness. So it's necessary for human consciousness to manifest in the way that it does. A brain is necessary, a body is necessary, but that doesn't mean it's a source of consciousness. So sometimes I guess, people think that, well, because we know that brains can degenerate or get damaged and that consciousness is affected, that's evidence that the brain and consciousness are the same thing. Well, logically, it doesn't follow, because a brain could be a receiver, just as a radio can get damaged and then it won't work. But the radio waves are still there. So that's another way of thinking about the relationship between mind and body, or mind and brain, consciousness and brain. And I think it's truer as a relationship. Yeah. Maybe one more?
Okay. So this is an anonymous question. I find the concept of impermanence somehow comforting, but the apparent permanence of spirit is somehow inconceivable to me.
Yes.
How are these things compatible, I wonder?
Okay. So it's a question about impermanence. The person says that they find the notion of impermanence comforting, but the notion of a permanence of spirit somehow incompatible and inconceivable. So I'm glad you asked that, because when I am talking about something surviving the death of the body, consciousness surviving the death of the body, from a Dharmic perspective, whatever it is that survives is not permanent, at least not in the sense of a fixed, static permanence. Buddhism, one of the very, very basic teachings of Buddhism is that nothing is fixed and static, even for an instant, even for a moment. Consciousness, when we're alive, isn't fixed and static, just as the body has no stasis. It's always in flux. There is only constant flux. So if something carries on after death, it too will be a continuation of that flux, like a stream of energy, or even the notion of a stream is a good notion. A stream has some sort of definition, but the water is constantly changing. It's constantly in flux. There's no static fixed point. So that's how I think of it, and that's what the Buddhist tradition would say, that just because something survives death, that doesn't mean that there's a permanent self. And again, I'll come back to this in the days that come. Buddhism would say that it's more like we're a stream of energy that has crystallized as a body and a mind in this life, in this form. When the body dies, that stream of energy will carry on in some way and eventually will crystallize in another form. Yeah, so there's continuity, but not permanence, not stasis. Okay, so it's probably time to wrap up there. But yes, I'd like to leave you with a question to say, to possibly reflect on in the days to come this week, is what do you believe happens after death? Do you believe in some sort of continuity after death? I'm just looking at Vimlachitra and Nagabodhi's beautiful dog, who's, anyway, never mind. So do you believe in something continuing after death, or do you believe that the death of the body is the end of consciousness? And whichever one that is, or maybe you don't know, and that's, of course, completely fine as well, whichever it is, what effect does that have on the way you live your life? Does it have an effect on the way you live your life? I'm suggesting it probably does. And it would be good to just reflect on, how does our notion of what death is affect how we're living our life, what we're prioritizing in life, what we think is important in life, what our goals in life are, what our ambitions are, our aims are, what our relationships are like. How does it affect our lives? I think that's the key thing that I keep wanting to come back to. And so yeah, come back tomorrow if you if this was interesting. I hope it was stimulating. And see if you come back tomorrow, and I want to explore other perspectives on death. Particularly, I want to start looking more at a more traditional Dharmic view of death. I wanted to start off personally and then go from there, and hopefully see you then. Yeah. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good. See you tomorrow, hopefully.